one of the things that, as researchers, that we end up doing is we try and trace back these genealogies, right? So if we're working in this community and we're trying to trace back their lineage, and that's just take, for instance, the United States. So we oftentimes, we all have like birth certificates, right? Well, that's one way of gaining information. Every child that's born gets a birth certificate. We know when and where, who the parents are, who the doctor was, and it gives us this amount of information. But the birth certificate really isn't that old of a tool of collecting records. So there were plenty of kids that were born before there were birth certificates to trace back. One of the things that would oftentimes happen, especially in the United States, is that if you were born and you were a member of a church, then that church would actually record your birth. So a lot of genealogical researchers will go to various churches within a community and look at their records to see who was born and when and what their parents were named and all of that kind of stuff. So the church has become very important. And then we have some governmental records, such as like the census. Okay, the census takes in, okay, so this is the person that lives here, this is how many children they have, this is what their names are. But even then, the census isn't all that great because the census, up until really not that long ago, wouldn't record you if you were African American, if you were Native American. This is something that I've actually run into myself. Two of my great-grandmothers weren't Native. One was Cherokee and one was Osage. And when I go back and look at the census information for my great-great-grandparents, they do not list my grandmothers. And that's because they weren't considered to be citizens. They weren't considered worthy enough to be included in that census data. Even though the husbands were there and the kids were there, they were not. So, again, that sort of record keeping can be difficult to do. We have more ways of tracking down family, especially in the genetic age, right? With different companies that record and then compare genetic data. However, I think the thing that I want to bring up when it comes to these companies that collect genetic data and then say, oh, you're 25% English and 25% Scottish and 45% French. These companies are basing a lot of their information on genetic material that's already been captured. Well, here's the thing, especially when it comes to different groups that might not necessarily have that genetic information available, that you might get false information. One of the issues that we've experienced in my family is that my sister had one of these tests done, and it showed none of the traits that you might find in Native American. And one of the issues that we're finding is that sampling from different groups is greater than others. When it comes to Native American groups, there's a little bit of a stigma that can sometimes be attached, not for everybody, but for a lot of people. And this stems from this idea of who is Native, okay? So the United States government decided that if you want to be considered to be Native American, you have to have 25% blood quantum to be considered Native. What that means is that basically one of your grandparents has to be full-blooded Native to be for you to be considered also Native. That meant that one of your parents would have to have been half Native, and that you yourself would have been quarter Native. If you can break down genetics like that, which genetics does not break down like that. But for the sake of what the government was trying to do, this is what they came up with. So they put a federal mandate on your Indianness, right? How Indian are you? Well, one of the problems that arises is that if you were to go below this number, you would no longer be considered Native, and therefore would no longer get the benefits of being considered that Native. And those benefits can, for the most part, are not great. Okay, and this is a misconception that a lot of Americans have that we really need to get over. And it's that Native Americans, because they're wards of the government, get money, just free money from the government. They get stipends and all kinds of stuff. And this is true to some extent, oftentimes not to the extent that people believe. When I was working on the Ute Mountain Reservation, the average amount of money that a tribal member would get from the federal government, I think, was $127 a year. So not much, right? That isn't a whole heck of a lot. So a lot of people out there, there's, oh, I wish I could be Native and collect money. It's like, you're not, don't expect anything, because these communities would be doing a whole heck of a lot better if there was more money. Other communities, on the other hand, say like the Southern Ute, who have kind of a boatload of cash. None of it has anything to do with the government, except for the fact that when they were placed on this reservation in southwestern Colorado, much later they discovered like natural gas and other heavy minerals that could be mined, and they made a lot of money off of that. And then through some good lawyering and advice, they were able to invest a lot of that money. And so they actually have a fair amount of cash that each member gets. None of it's coming from the government, though. However, those restrictions are still in place, right? To be able to get that money, you have to be able to say, I am this. So here's the problem, that if you have a genetic test that comes out and you take it and it says that you are less than this required amount to stay Native, then you lose those benefits. So it's not a great incentive for Native American populations to actually go out and get these genetic tests done, because they might lose their identity. Because here's the thing, and this is what most people don't understand, is that when you look at Native American communities, and let's take the Ute for example, well, they're not just Ute. They're probably Paiute, and there's probably some Navajo thrown in there, and there's probably some Apache thrown in there, and there's probably these other bits and pieces of families that have gone back and traded and been intermingling with for generations. And this could be generations before even colonization took place. But those specific genetic traits might show up differently in these different populations. So people might lose their identity. If you're a Ute Mountain tribe, while the federal guidelines is 25%, the tribal guideline is 50%. So if you don't match that 50%, let's say you're 3/4 Ute and you end up marrying a white woman, your kids will not qualify to be a member of the tribe because they don't meet that 50% guidelines that the tribe has. This creates lots of issues. So you're going to have a lot of people that are going to be resistant to that. So when we are looking at like genetic material from like 23andMe and all these other companies, remember that there might be some groups out there that are underrepresented in this genetic data. And that might be very much intentional. So I think it's always good to keep in mind that when you're doing research, acknowledging the limits of that research, acknowledging that there are flaws that that could take place when you're doing this type of research. So, yeah, when it comes to doing stuff like that, really important to pay attention. Getting back to the slide here, one of the issues that oftentimes happened when we're trying to trace back lineages, especially in the United States, is that things changed. What do I mean by this? Well, a lot of folks that came over from Europe, basically, when they got to the United States, they're like, we are creating a new identity. And sometimes this was forced upon people as well. Let's not forget that. But in a lot of different cases, this was basically forced upon people to change their names. For example, my mother's maiden name is Yale, but it's spelled Yehle. But it's a Swiss name, which originally was spelled Jehle, but was pronounced Yale. So when they got to the United States, and you had a Yale with a Jehle, because the J's were pronounced like Y's, they were like, this really doesn't make any sense, and this doesn't sound American. So we're going to change your name to Yale, and we're going to change the spelling. So now you've got a different pronunciation and a different way of spelling that name. And you can see the complications that you might have while trying to trace back your lineage. As people came and immigrated to the United States, they might have their names changed. And tracing that back can be tough. What if you were brought over as a slave? What if your ancestors were slaves? We can see the obvious problem. A lot of times, slaves were given English names and were also given the last name of the slave owner. So tracing back where slaves might have come from has been exceptionally hard. And this is actually where genetic research is actually proving a lot of good, is that we're capable of going back and following genetic lines to their places of origin. And this is a great opportunity for researchers to say, okay, now that we see this, now that we know what's happening, and we have a means of tracing back, even if it's not, on paper, we can actually find the place that this is, that these folks have been taken from. And so there are some things that we can do when it comes to like African Americans that have a lineage of slavery. So there is a benefit to genetic research there. But again, we're finding that a lot of times it's hard to go back. Now, in some cases, one of the things that we'll oftentimes look for, and especially in like American culture, is that if you've got like a family Bible, a family Bible will oftentimes have all of the dates and the marriages and all that stuff put into that Bible as a means of recording that information. And that Bible is passed on from generation to generation. And we have found these family Bibles that go back 300, 400, 500 years. And not a lot of them, because a lot of them don't last that long. But some do. And those books maintain a record of this family tradition. And those can be extremely beneficial when trying to do research. So when we're looking at a community, we have to look at not only how do they record their information, is it recorded in paper? Is it held by the government? Is it held by the church? Is it done through oral tradition? And if it's done by oral tradition, and there's some debate about this, and I honestly don't, I can see some of it, but oral tradition oftentimes has this connotation of not being very reliable. And to some extent that might be true. In other cases, there is information that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation, and it becomes sort of like you have the job of the orator, that they keep the community memory. That's their job, is to keep the memory. And then they pass that information on to the next generation and the next generation and so on and so forth. And some of this can be fairly reliable. It gives us a good understanding of how people have maintained their families, maintained their family identity through this oral tradition. So you can't discount that. And of course, sometimes it might change. There might be some issues. But we found that in recorded information as well. People will mark down different names. They might not record one of the parents' names, depending on the circumstances. Born out of wedlock, right? That was a big issue back in the day. So they might not have a father's name, or they might not record the mother's name. Or, if you had a daughter that had a child very, very young through lots of different ways, rape or, just young kids being stupid, maybe the grandmother would take on the role of parentage and would put their name as the parent instead of their child's name, who was the rightful mother. So we know that documents can be changed and adapted to suit whatever they need at the time for that. So that's always something to take into account, is that documents are rarely ever, not rarely ever, oftentimes they are in good standing. Every once in a while there is something that is missed. And when it comes to stuff like the census, which was racially motivated, that can also be an issue, as it is today. Our 2020 census has been dealing with certain issues that deal with racially biased approaches. And it's amazing that in today's life that we have to deal with this kind of thing. But this is the truth, and especially now, there is a lot of things that we have to consider when we're thinking about how this information is recorded, what that information is going to be used for, and is there an issue with doing it, with recording your information for the census. So the politics of it is frightening at times, and something that we should all be extremely wary of, and how we look at the census, and how we record our information. These are scary times. So I'm just going to leave it right there for now. Okay, so one of the other problems that we might have as well is called generational memory. So, especially when we live in a community where we don't necessarily have that storyteller that maintains that family tradition, we will think about our direct family, okay, our nuclear family. Well, as an individual, there's a good chance that you knew your great-grandparents, because most people live to the age where they can have grandkids or great-grandkids. Now, you might have been fairly young when your great-grandparents might have passed away, but you had the opportunity to at least know them. But you probably didn't know them very well. Not nearly as well as your parents, and not nearly as well as their parents would have. So by the time you come around, you know somewhat about them. You might know some of their history, some of their tradition, but you might not know everything, right? And you never got a chance to meet their parents, so that information probably isn't going to be very forthcoming. And we end up having this generational loss of information. So that can also be an issue when trying to record information or trying to collect information on families. A lot of it can be dependent on the kind of resources they had at hand. So whether they might have letters that they wrote to each other, whether or not they were literate and could write letters back and forth. Let's not forget that literacy, as of right now, is like we're fairly literate as a country. You go back 100 years, that was not the case, right? I mean, a lot of kids didn't get out of a 6th grade education and didn't have to do a lot of reading and writing and didn't keep it. So that's an issue, is literacy. How many people were actually able to write those stories down and write those letters and tell that history. So as literacy becomes more prevalent within a community, we find that it's capable of transferring that information to subsequent generations.